when I realized the story had to change. There comes a point in some struggles when the facts themselves have not changed, but the way you understand them does. That is what happened to me. For a long time, I knew something was wrong. I knew I was hurting. I knew eating was harder than it should have been. I knew my health was already fragile in ways that made all of this more serious, not less. But I still had not fully understood the kind of case I was trying to make. At first, I think I was looking at it the way many people would. There was a problem in my mouth. I needed treatment. I needed help. That felt obvious enough to me. But what I had not yet grasped was that obvious is not the same thing as legible inside a system built on categories, codes, and narrow definitions. The system was not going to respond to the full human truth of what I was living. It was going to respond to how the problem was framed. That realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. Because once I looked closely, the pattern was undeniable. This was not a matter of appearance. It was not about wanting something elective or ideal. It was not a matter of simple discomfort. What was happening in my mouth was affecting my ability to chew properly, maintain nutrition, tolerate food, manage the rest of my health, and function day to day. The consequences were not staying in one part of my body. They were moving outward into everything else. That changed the story. Or maybe more accurately, it finally revealed the real story that had been there all along. I began to understand that this was not just a dental problem. It was a functional problem, a medical problem, a quality of life problem, a nutritional problem, a stability problem, a problem that touched digestion, medication, pain, and the basic act of trying to keep my body going. Once I saw that clearly, I also saw something else. If I did not learn how to say it in the language the system recognized, the case would keep getting flattened into something smaller than it really was. That was a hard thing to accept, because it meant that truth alone was not enough. Suffering alone was not enough. Even medical records by themselves were not enough. The story had to be assembled correctly. The connections had to be made visible. The right documents had to sit next to each other. The right phrases had to be used. The whole picture had to be translated into something the system could not as easily mislabel or ignore. That is when I began gathering everything with a different kind of purpose. I was no longer just collecting records because I had them. I was collecting them because I understood they were pieces of an argument. I needed records that showed not only what treatment was proposed, but why it mattered medically. I needed the doctor's perspective. I needed the treatment plan. I needed supporting records that showed the bigger health context. I needed evidence of gastrointestinal problems, nutritional strain, pain, history, and the way one issue was making other issues worse. I was learning, in real time, that systems often require a person to prove not just that they are sick, but that their sickness belongs in the correct administrative story. That is one of the crueler realities of complex care. A person can be suffering in a very real and medically serious way, but if the case gets placed in the wrong category, the burden shifts onto that person to keep pulling it back into view. And that is exactly what started happening. The more I tried to move forward, the more it became clear that this was not going to be a simple matter of submitting one request and waiting for a fair answer. This was going to require structure, documentation, precision, persistence. It was going to require me to do something that many patients should never have to do while they are already unwell: become fluent in the difference between what they know is true and what the system is willing to recognize. I remember how sharp that realization felt. Not because it made me feel powerful, at least not at first. It made me feel tired. It made me feel the size of what I was up against. It made me realize that I was entering a world where language could protect or expose you, where one misclassification could cost time, and where being medically right did not automatically mean being processed correctly. But it also gave me direction. Once I understood that the case had to be framed as medical necessity, I stopped looking at it as a vague request for help and started seeing it as something I had to build carefully. Every note, every summary, every letter, every explanation became part of establishing the same central truth. This was about restoring function and preventing further harm. That truth became the backbone of everything. I was not asking for luxury. I was not asking for cosmetics. I was not asking to be indulged. I was asking for treatment that I believed was medically necessary because my condition was affecting essential parts of daily life and overall health. I was asking to be reviewed under the right lens. I was asking for the system to see the difference between something superficial and something structural, between something optional and something necessary. And once I learned to see my own case that way, I could not go back. Because after that point, every misstep in the process looked different to me. Every confusion about classification, every delay, every mixed signal, every question about what department was handling what, it all became more serious. Not just frustrating, but consequential. Because if the story was being told incorrectly inside the system, then the decision could be built on the wrong understanding from the start. That is the point where my role changed too. I was no longer just the person living with the problem. I was becoming the person trying to protect the truth of it. That shift is exhausting, but it is also where something deeper began in me. I started to understand how many people are forced into that same position. How many people are not just asking for care, but also trying to guard their own case from being misunderstood. How many people are carrying real pain while also carrying folders, timelines, letters, deadlines, and the fear that if they miss one detail, the system will decide they did not prove enough. That is when the fight became bigger than the immediate treatment. It became about clarity, about language, about making something real impossible to shrink into something easy. And that was only the beginning.